Hi folks, this is Chuck Black. This is an extra episode as part of either the Quokka walkthrough or Python 52 weeks or whatever. I'm going to be talking about remote workers, which is something that is going to be available in the next Quokka VM that we make available to you guys. Remote workers have been there for a while, but I added some functionality and we thought that it would be useful if I describe it. There are pages where I describe this in the wiki, in the Quokka wiki, which I will reference for you. There's a page in the screen where we're displaying workers, and you can see that I have local workers and I have remote workers. You can see I have a Quokka VM that's running the Quokka server here, and I also have a VM that is specifically doing only worker stuff, so it's running in the background. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I will be showing you the files that need to be modified. Those include the workers.yaml file and then capture monitors, which specify where the actual remote workers are located for a particular subnet. There's capture monitors, port scan monitors, traceroute monitors, etc. I will talk a little bit about how you need to set up your remote worker to make sure that it points at the right Quokka service, and then you need to have your Quokka service point at the right remote worker if you're going to use a remote worker. By default, we don't use it, and we just use localhost, but if you are going to attempt to use a remote worker, that's what I'm going to be talking about. So hopefully this will explain some of those things, and will clear up any questions that you have for when this becomes available. Thanks, and enjoy the lesson. Hi everybody, so in this little video we're going to talk about remote workers. So that's the topic of what we're going to be discussing. Now you'll notice in the GitHub wiki for Quokka that I have discussions of remote workers, both what the user interface looks like, what it's telling you, when you drill down to the status, what information it is giving you. I also have a page on communication with these remote workers. I mentioned that we use remote workers for doing packet capture, extended port scans, and traceroute, and I explain how that works in here. I'm not going to go through all of the details. I'm hoping you will benefit from these nice pictures that I've created and my discussion of it, and if you have questions you can give me a little bit more. You can send me those questions via whatever mechanism is appropriate for you, Discord or comments on the YouTube channel, etc. So let's talk a little bit about how to get them to work. So what I have here is I have my Quokka software. I'm looking at workers. I'm going to be looking at these other YAML files. Before we do that though, let me get started with a few of these windows, just that I've started things so that we can look at what actually is going on here. I'm going to go to Quokka. This is how I tend to do it, just because I like to run things independently. David had me build something that did a run all, and so you can certainly do that as well. But I just prefer to have them separate for whatever reason. There I'm running, up here I'm running the Quokka server, down here I'm running the UI. Remember the UI is split into two parts. There's the piece that serves up the screens, and then there's the part that serves the data. And as we know, the part that serves the data comes from the Quokka server here. The part that serves the screens comes from this Node.js thing that is actually running here when I did the npm start, which is started when I did the run UI. Now I'm going to run my local workers also. I need to go to everything is in the Quokka directory here. So I'm going to say run workers. So now I'm starting my workers, and they should start up, and it will tell you how they've started up, who it's trying to connect to, what its serial number is. It's talking to the Quokka service on the local host, and then it's going to be giving a heartbeat every, I was going to say a minute, but that looks like it's more like 20 seconds. That is configurable, of course, depending on how we set it up. So if I were to look at my worker screen here, I can see that, okay, well, this is localhost, and I have 3 workers running on localhost. And why do I have 3 of them? Well, they have different types. One is for traceroute, one is for port scan, and one is for packet capture. And you can see I'm beginning to gather information. It says I'm using 27% of the CPU and 63% of the memory. I suspect that if I were to go over here to the system monitor and we were to look at it, I would see that I'm using, just like 64%, 63% of the memory. And the CPU utilization, I'm actually not sure how to calculate it based on these 2 cores, but when I ask Ubuntu what its CPU utilization is, this is the number that it's telling me. And it is, I'm capturing this data periodically. Now it says 41%. That I'm going to assume that that's roughly the same. If I look at the line here, it seems to be fluctuating above and below 40%. So that is what I'm able to see in this workers table. Now, one other thing I want to show you here, and that is this. I'm going to show it to you right now. This is my VirtualBox Manager, and you can see I have my Quokka Ubuntu 20. That's my development Ubuntu. The one that I ship out to you guys is, I believe, Quokka Ubuntu Clean, and then the version number. I'm not sure if you'll be getting version 10 or 11. I may just bump that because I've added in the more remote worker stuff into the code. So that is the actual Ubuntu system, and here is a worker system. And so you can see that it is currently powered off. I have this Ubuntu 20 running. I have this worker not running yet. I probably want to be wise about this. I'm going to look here and see, okay, well, what's my memory situation? My memory situation is that I'm using 11 out of 16 gig. So this is running Windows, and it's running my Ubuntu VM, which takes up a lot of memory. This is the one that I'm doing my work on here, this Ubuntu 20. And then it also has, or it will have in just a minute, my worker VM, which you can see, my worker VM, I only have 2 gig set up, so it's going to be running in 2 gig. So I'm going to go ahead and start that, and then I'm going to bring it over so that you can see it. One of the things I'm going to do in the process of doing that is I'm going to make this display a little bit smaller so that you'll be able to see both my VM that I'm running right here, which is my Ubuntu, which is running the Quokka server. And then let me show you over here. Here's my other Ubuntu system that is going to be running, and that is going to be running my Quokka worker. So while we're waiting for that to start up, let's look at the actual code, not actually the code, but the YAML files that we have defined. So here is my workers.yaml, and the way that I've designed this is that you specify every worker, even if there are multiple workers on the same system. So get into your mind that a worker is not only its location, but it's also the worker type. So it's a combination of location and worker type. Here we have localhost capture. Let me do it like this. Here we have localhost port scan. Here we have localhost traceroute. Now if I go down further, this is Yoga Laptop, and this is actually how I have it set up. I notice now this actual wording is incorrect because it's not running on my laptop, it's actually running on a VM, my worker VM. So I could change that, but for right now, just consider this VM that I'm running, that's just a worker VM, to be called my Yoga Laptop. You can call it whatever you want. Let me log in here. Quokka 123, bang. I think is what I called it. And this is going to be starting up, and I'm going to put it down here in the corner so that we can observe what's going on with both of these at the same time. So while that is starting, let me show you what else is here. So these are my workers. What I need to do, the way that I've set it up, and you may say, well, that seems overly complicated to me. I thought you were Mr. Simple. And I have to agree, I do think that it is more complicated than I would like. So I might consider simplifying this at some point in the future, but it sort of snowballed on me a little bit because I wanted the functionality to be able to run traceroute in a different spot than maybe port scan is run, which is in a different spot. Maybe you want to move capture around to different systems since it's just a small piece of code. So I decided to do those independently. And you can see here, I have capture monitors.yaml and I have port scan monitors.yaml. I called these monitors at the beginning. They're really workers now. I haven't changed that. And then traceroute monitors. Now, what these files have is they have a mapping from IP address. Actually, better way would be to think of it as a subnet because that's what it is. And it gets mapped to a particular IP address where there will exist, hopefully, a worker. And as I even think about this, I think, okay, well, maybe, certainly there may be better ways to do this. But this is how I've done it. The idea is if you want to have monitors or workers running in all of your different subnets so that they can do port scans locally, they can do capture locally so they can see more traffic, so that they can do traceroute locally, then you can have different subnets representing different workers servicing different subnets. Now you can see, you won't be surprised here, 0.0.0.0/0, that's going to hit everything else, and so it matches everything else. As you go through the Quokka walkthrough that I'm in the process of doing, when we go through this eventually, you'll see how this gets started up and the code that I've written to do this. So these three things. Now normally this value here on your Quokka VM, for example, that's going to be localhost, and so everything is mapping to a remote worker that's actually running locally. And when you do a run all, remember I mentioned the difference between doing a run of some of these things individually, like we're looking at right here. Here's my three different services that are running. Kind of don't really fit under the screen the way it is now, but you can see I have my Quokka server, I have my user interface, and then I have my Quokka workers right here, and those are running locally on my system. And when you do a .run all, it's going to be running these locally, and in addition to that, on your Quokka VM, this value here is going to be localhost. But I've set it to something different because I want to run it on a different system. 192, 168, 254, 153. You may be wondering where that is, but you probably have already figured, oh, I'll bet you that's the IP address of your worker that you've set up here. And so I'm going to pull this up. If my IP address hasn't changed, then that should indeed be it. I'm going to do IPA, and 192, 168, 254, 153, that's the same as this value here. So this is my system on which all of my diagnostic type services for capturing, packet capturing, port scanning, and traceroute, they're all going to run down here. So let's go ahead and run this. Remember, this is running in 2 gig of RAM, and I believe I told you my super duper secret, which is that this VM is no different than the actual Quokka VM. The only difference is I've set it down to 2 gig, and I'm assuming you're only going to run workers here. So the way that you run them is exactly the same way we do elsewhere, which is do run workers.sh. So I'm going to go ahead and start those. And if we go back here, let's look at our workers. We see that this is actually red right now, and it's going to update. This is kind of handy if it's gotten it. It's going to update in 1 second. And notice it updated in 1 second, and these are all green now. That's because this worker has started sending its heartbeat messages. And when it sends a heartbeat message, then Quokka knows to update the database. And if we were to look at our Quokka server, you probably would see something. Okay, here's a received heartbeat, and you can see it says from none. That's an indication that I'm not filling that in correctly, but you can probably see, let's see, do I even put the IP address? I don't put the IP address in there. I do have the serial number of that thing, and that is something that is important that you need to be aware of, making sure that they have the right serial number. The idea here with the serial number is this. We want to be able to identify every single worker that's running in the network. And so we could do it by IP address, but what we tend to do instead is we use this serial number as something that identifies it. And if we were to go back here and we were to look at workers, you would see that, okay, these workers are all defined and they have serial numbers. And this is partly for security, so that devices need to have the right serial number. As you know, we're not really taking great pains to go through and do a ton of security, but this is probably adequate for now for our teaching. So let's look here. We mentioned before we have these three, which are all running on host localhost. All right, and that's the serial number we noticed that it has. You'll notice in here also we have important information for keeping track of service level availability, because we may want to show that at some point in time. This is very important. I need to be saying, what is my connection type? Why is that important? Well, it's important because there are different types of communication. This remote worker communication talks about remote workers that may use RabbitMQ that instantaneously will send a message down to my remote worker that says, hey, go do this, and it will get it immediately. In situations where we need to use HTTP, then what will end up happening is the device is going to be sending the heartbeat. In our situation, it's doing it every 20 seconds, and it will get from this list of commands the commands that it needs to execute. And so in our situation, let's look at how it is configured. I keep doing that incorrectly. Let's look at how it's configured. We're using this Yoga laptop. And what is the connection type? It's RabbitMQ. I've tested this with HTTP as well. We'll be using RabbitMQ for what we're doing. So we're going to be, when somebody requests packet capture or when they request traceroute or port scan, we should see it immediately show up right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Quokka. And now for Quokka, services are the funnest thing to do traceroute for. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do a traceroute. Now I want you to be keeping your eye on both things, this thing over here as well as Quokka that I just showed you. I'm going to click on traceroute, and you can see something happened over here. There was a disruption in that stuff. And guess what? Here actually, I was getting complimented on this wonderful graphic. I didn't create that graphic. The service that I used to gather that information, I can't even remember if it's Scapy. I think that it probably is, although my apologies to Nmap if that's what I used. That's what generated this for me. And so all I'm doing is I'm sending the information back. And you can see, okay, well, that's cool. Now I saw that the request went out to the remote worker. Here's where the request came in. Traceroute worker received the message, initializes its own thread because it has to run it in its own thread. This is the target that it's trying to get the traceroute for. And then this is the actual information, generating traceroute image. I wrote that out. And then here is the trace route. This is a byte string that actually is going to translate into this image right there. We received it back and we printed it out. Now let's look at hosts, which are more interesting when it comes to port scans. And this is going to be pretty boring, but I'm going to do an extended port scan there. But first, I want to get us down to the very bottom so that we can see what's happening down here. All right, so I'm going to do a port scan on one of my Amazon devices. You can see there's the information about doing the port scan. We're utilizing whatever we're using to go get that information. Here you can actually see the information. When you look here, it should look very similar. Port ID 1, protocol TCP, state closed, etc. So this is the information that I sent to my remote worker via RabbitMQ. Now the information that comes back, I'm sending that back using HTTP. So here's the information that I print out, sending port scan. I'm using Nmap to do that, to get the port scan. And this is what I've ended up printing out there. Now packet capture is the same way. Probably the most interesting thing to do packet captures on perhaps at this moment is going to be one of my devices. So I'm going to go ahead and do a port scan. And as you may know, there's a couple things different. Number one, I haven't actually started the scan yet. This is a little bit of inconsistency on my part. I probably would want to change that at some point in time, and I may do that. But right now you have to click Start Capture. And once again, you're going to see something happen over here. So I'm going to say Start Capture. And guess what? It's pretty busy. There's a lot of stuff that it just got. Okay, this is all the packets that it just sniffed and received. And you can see for every single packet it receives, I send an HTTP message back to the Quokka server, and it gets put into the database. Now I've written code that actually trims the database after information becomes stale. So we keep it around for a little while, but we do a decent job of trimming expired information. Let me move this over here so that it looks a little bit easier to read. You can see my system's a little bit slow. If we look here, you can see getting closer to my 16 gig. I'm not there yet, but you can see things have slowed down a little bit. Anyway, here's my packet capture. I've received 141. You can see it still buzzing along here in the background, yeah. So next time we do this, in fact, if I just refresh packets, all I'm doing is going to the database. Now I'm up to 283. You've probably seen me or David or somebody show you this. I just print out the information that I got back, and here's the hex version of that information. So this is my remote worker now. I just do this by default for, I'm trying to remember, I think I do it for 5 minutes. So I'm doing packet capturing for 5 minutes, and then it will go down and it will become just pretty much dormant and sitting there in the background. But that is how remote workers work. So the way that things need to be set up from your perspective is something like this. You need to make sure that your worker is set up correctly. For me, I set these values and I set it to the right IP address. That's the IP address of where my remote worker is running. So that's one thing. When I specify where I want the captures to happen, I needed to point them at the correct worker IP address. So you can see I'm setting, whenever anything comes in for a packet capture, for port scan, or for traceroute, they're all mapping to that particular IP address. You will forget to set one or the other of these things. I would like to make it more fail-safe, and maybe I will in the future, but this is, like I say, my bailing myself out is always to say, hey, it's just a training exercise for you to learn and for you to be taught how to do stuff. And when I go through all of the different walkthroughs, you'll be able to see the code. Maybe you understand it well enough to walk through it yourself and see how it works, but that's kind of what we're doing. So that is an overview of remote workers. Hopefully I've given you enough to be able to be a little bit dangerous and understand how this works. Reading the documentation will help you out. Here is my description of remote workers in general and what all the information means when I print them out. I'm trying to go through in my mind, is there anything else that I needed to talk about? And I can't think of that right at this moment. So I'm going to wrap this up and say hopefully this makes enough sense for you to understand what's going on and to maybe use your own remote worker. We've talked about using Raspberry Pi devices. Those would be a great thing to plug into a network, to give an IP address, and just to download this software. If you are going to download the software manually and not use the VM that I gave you, then you'll need to know that you have to set up your system to allow RabbitMQ. And if you recall, if I can go to the right spot, I'm going to walk there. Here's home. I'm going to go from home in the wiki and walk down here to the installed software. And when I get down to the installed software, you're going to see information about RabbitMQ. So you need to make sure on your device that you set up a Quokka user and Quokka password. So you need to add this user. This is the username. That's the password. And this is the permissions. Alternatively, you can just use the VM. That's what I would recommend initially. I will be working on creating a Raspberry Pi version or something to that effect that we can consider doing, but that's a little bit down the road. I've kind of got my hands full with creating these teaching videos and people telling me, where's week 12, where's week 13, where's week 14 of the Python 52 weeks. So that's keeping me pretty much occupied. Anyway, hopefully this gives you a general overview. Oh, you know what? I just remembered there's one other thing I need to do. I'm going to say stop the workers /stop w workers. So I'm going to stop these workers. I want to show you what run workers looks like on this system. This is something else you need to change. Sorry, I forgot to tell you this. So I'm going to say cat run workers.sh. So here's the commands that I use to run the workers. So you can see I'm just running the same file, Quokka worker. I'm passing in information about my own host. I'm passing in what type of worker this is, whether it's a capture, port scan, or traceroute. I need to point it at the Quokka server. That's what this Q is, this Q parameter. And that's the IP address of the Quokka server. If I were to go over here and actually create a new window so I can show it to you, I'm going to say IP space A. And you would see this is 192.168.254.136. And you can see that indeed is my Quokka server. So I have to tell my worker where the Quokka server is. That's because it's going to be going back to that server like phone home in order to tell it that it is alive, to do the heartbeat and to get commands and stuff. It's going to specify its own serial number, so that's configurable also. And it's going to tell it what is the communication type. And this can be either HTTPS or RabbitMQ. And depending on how it's set up, you'll want it to match what you've specified in your workers here. So if you've specified RabbitMQ, you need this side to do RabbitMQ as well. This causes the Quokka server to do RabbitMQ messages out to the worker, and this is the worker that tells it to listen for RabbitMQ messages. Okay, I do think that that is it. Hopefully I've described it well enough that you have a general idea. To be dangerous, to maybe do this on your own. And yeah, hopefully that will be adequate. And if not, I'm sure I'll hear from you, from those of you who are interested in doing it. Anyway, good luck and happy quacking. All right, so just to review, what did we talk about? We talked about remote workers. Here's a worker screen that you can look at with my workers. You can see that we have that available. I talked about making sure you go to the wiki and understand what's going on from there. I showed you that there is actually going to be a Quokka remote worker VM that you can run things on. We talked about the files that you'll need to be aware of if you want to configure remote workers, one of them being workers.yaml, where you do your remote, specify your remote workers. And then for every different type of worker, capture, monitor, as well as port scan and traceroute. There will be multiple lines here, of course, if you have multiple subnets, but you need to make sure that you map it correctly to the right worker address, and that's the worker IP address that you see in here, and that would be the IP address of this device. You can see that it is successfully sending heartbeats back to the Quokka server, and also I'm going to stop the workers right now, and then I did a cat of run workers, and you can see here that there are parameters that you need to make sure you pass in. The one that is of most interest here is going to be this one. This needs to be the IP address of your Quokka server. Hopefully this makes sense. Also, hopefully I haven't left anything out. Good luck with your using of remote workers in Quokka.